Thank you so much, Tara. That was fantastic, and good to know that Swift, like all of us, regretted drinking bad white wine. We're going to move straight on now and have the questions at the end. So the next speaker is Dr. Patricia McCarthy, whose recent book, Enjoying Claret in Georgian Ireland, A History of Amiable Excess, many of you may know. Patricia is an architectural historian and has written widely on the life of the country house in Georgian Ireland. Patricia.
So I just press. You have this clicker here, forward and backward. Okay, that's absolutely fine. Thank you. Right, well, good evening, everybody. Not such a good evening outside, but anyway, it's lovely in here, and I'm so happy and so pleased to be here to talk to you all about Claret, which I have enjoyed writing about. Even though it took me a long time to write the book, it was well worth it, and I enjoyed every moment of it. It was fun as well as everything else. So I'm going to talk about Ireland's love affair with Claret. Francis Andrews, Provost of Trinity College, Dublin, builder of the Provost House on Grafton Street, which is still there, used for the purpose for which it was built. He was the proud owner of what he described as an extremely well-furnished wine cellar. In the 1760s, on a solo 10-day journey from Madrid to Seville, he took with him 10 bottles of claret and the same of Grave. When in Nice, he had the foresight to send some excellent Hermitage and Champagne here before me, and I daily expect a hogshead of claret from Bordeaux. 30 years before that, in 1728, Samuel Madden, one of the founder members of the Dublin Society, now, of course, the Royal Dublin Society, wrote that drinking had become so fashionable in Ireland that gentlemen competed eagerly to have the largest cellar and spend the most on hogsheads of wine every year. And alarmingly, this was spreading down the social scale as people sought the glory of drinking like their betters. The wine was red and from Bordeaux, popularly known as claret, though Jonathan Swift, of course, as we have just heard, referred to it as Irish wine. Oh yeah, sorry, that's advertising myself. So just to have a look at this, I presume you can all see it. I can't even see what you're looking at, but I presume it's all of this, the table A. So you have the grand wines. This was from 1739 to 1740, 1 year. Grand wines in England, 300 tons of wine. Fine wines in England, 700. Fine wines in Scotland, 2,500, and fine wines in Ireland, 4,000. In wine terms, a ton is 252 gallons. So it was one heck of a lot of claret, the beloved drink in Ireland. Let me see, I think I have another one here to show you. Yeah, just wanted to show you this as well, because this is a really, really interesting. Imported French wines, 1771 to 1780, 27,802. Well, actually, I'm not going to read it out to you. You can read it there yourselves on it. The amount of wine exported from France to Ireland between 1771 and 1789 was double the amount of French wine that was imported to England, Scotland, and Wales combined. So we did love our claret, I'm afraid. So they give us a picture of the vast amount of Bordeaux wine, which was consumed by the aristocracy and gentry of Ireland in the 18th century. You will notice that the amounts of wine being drunk in those figures, it gets much less as you come to around about 1802. You have to bear in mind that this was around about the time of the Act of Union. So everything was changing in Ireland at that time. Everything was changing in Dublin in particular. And you know all about that. The 18th century was a time of peace in Ireland after the wars of the previous century, when large and unfortified houses were being designed and constructed, and vast sums were being spent on furnishing interiors that included, of course, the provision of a wine cellar. From as far back as the 1st century BCE, Architects and engineers such as Vitruvius and later Alberti advised that the wine cellar should be underground and enclosed, with windows facing north, built somewhere solid, free from the vibration of carts and from damp, and the floor should be paved, leaving a small dip in the center to collect any leakage. Pretty well, that's the way one simply built their wine cellars at the time and continued to do so. Tunnels and caves dug into hillsides were ideal for storage due to their constant temperatures, and some of these were lined with brick. The catacombs in Rome were used to store wine. Interestingly, too, the French house, Champagne house, Tétanger, has cellars which are 18 meters below ground in 4th century Roman chalk mines that connect with the crypt of a 13th century Benedictine abbey. And apparently you can see them. I don't know anybody who has, but apparently you can actually get in and have a look at those now. So here we are. I just wanted to show you the plan of the Leinster House basement, because so many houses were being built at this time in Ireland. It was a time when there was plenty of money and everything was going in the right direction. And of course, the Duke of Leinster, or as he was, the Earl of Kildare first, built Kildare House. He knew in building that house, this was going to be the centre of social life. And so he obviously knew he would need quite an amount of wine. And so, as you can see here, he has, I have to look at it here. He has a very large space, as you can see, in his cellar purely for wine, which is what everybody drank. And just to show you a few, the one picture on the left here is Birr Castle, the absolutely gorgeous wine cellar in Birr Castle. And the other is a private cellar. But I wanted to show you that because I wanted to show you the bins, and I wanted to show you the labels which are on the bins, and talk about those a little bit later. By the 18th and 19th century, when supplies of alcohol were stored, where they were stored rather, was an essential part of large and medium-sized houses. Indeed, a large cellar was a selling point in an ad in Faulkner's Journal in 1758 for a handsome new house in Merrion Street to be let or sold that had 2 vaults which would hold 6 or 8 ton of wine. Plans of other houses like Townley Hall, County Louth, in an unexecuted plan, there was 1/3 of the entire area, 1/3 of the entire area of the basement. And I don't know if any of you know Townley Hall. It's a very large house, and so they had a very large basement. So 1/3 of the entire area was for wine, and the rest of it given out for beer and other drinks. In Crumcastle, County Fermanagh, they had 8 cellars in their plans, presumably by the architect Edward Blore, and he calculated that each of these 32 bins would hold about 30 dozen bottles. So, the mind boggles, really. These were the early, we just saw actually in Tara's presentation a picture of these sort of old bottles that they had. These were the ones when you were never quite sure of the amount of wine that you were getting into them, because they were, there was no standard set or anything like that. With the shelf life of less than a year before the wine turned to vinegar, the quick consumption of wine was necessary. Prior to the advent of the cork, and of course before wine could be laid down, bottles were stoppered with tapered wooden bungs wrapped in cloth that had been soaked in wax or oil that projected from the bottle. Up to then, the bottles varied in size and shape and were usually a greenish brown in colour. None of that mattered very much, because the bottles were simply filled at the cask and brought to the table. This was an excavation that happened at Rathfarnham Castle in Dublin, and these are a selection of the bottles that were found. And interestingly, you could have your bottle labelled with your own name. So as you can see there, Adam Loftus, who was the owner of Rathfarnham Castle, he had his AL and 1688, the year that he had that bottle made. Now, they were all different sizes, so you were never quite sure precisely how much wine you were getting in these bottles. It wasn't until much later when, I think I have a slide of it here. Oh yeah, we've seen that one before. It's this here I wanted to show you. Pierre Mitchell, he was of Irish descent, like his grandfather was Irish, and he came over to Bordeaux and very cleverly set up a bottle-making factory in the Chartrons area, which is precisely where all of the wine is kept before it's moved off to other countries and exported. But he was the man, and his glassworks were very close to Chartrons, but he was the one who actually designed the Bordeaux bottle that we still know today. It was his design, and obviously it held precisely what it said on the bottle or on the label. I just wanted to get back to this a little bit because I think the cellars and labels, I just found that really interesting when I started looking at this subject. First of all, with regard to labels on bottles, just to mention it, with the invention of lithography, the first printed paper labels were introduced in Germany in the early 19th century. So that was quite interesting. Up to that, you had to be extremely careful about your wine cellar. People had cellar books. I think I have a picture of one. Yeah, this was one from the cellar book of the O'Hara family from Sligo, dated to 1840, where the owner of the cellar has actually drawn a diagram for himself so that he'll know where his wine is located. But to get back to this, you see the small labels. Sorry, I have no pointer, so I can't show you where it is. But the small. They would have to be very careful to keep a good record of what the wine is, when it was bought, from whom it was bought, when might it be able to be drunk, when would it have definitely gone off, etc., etc. So you really needed somebody who was serious about wine and who would really look after your cellar as well as you would want it to be looked after. And a number of those cellar books have survived. They vary in relation to the information that you get, but generally under the name of the bin, the name of the wine is noted, when and from where it is purchased. Yes, it was very important also because they were buying wine from different suppliers all the time. So you did need to know whose wine you were drinking, so that you would be, if you particularly liked it, obviously you're going to be able to order it again. And also the price paid. Often information noted can include the vintage, and as I say, the date it may be drunk, and even tasting notes. Sometimes people added in, what was the occasion on which we drank this? How many guests did we have? What was their reaction? So one of the really good cellar books that I discovered was the one from the Lords Clonbrock in County Galway. They were very fussy about the way they put together their cellar book. Clients purchased wine from a range of wine merchants, one of the most notable among them being the Dublin firm of Sneyd, French and Barton, who specialised in claret. They dominated the wine trade in Ireland, and they were one of the suppliers to Dublin Castle. Among the firm's customers were Tom Connolly of Castletown, Viscount de Vesey, the Marquess of Abercorn, and the Cobbs of Newbridge House. Sir Robert Peel, the Chief Secretary for Ireland, recalled of Sneyd in 1829 that his house was, I quote, the first in Dublin when I was in Ireland, meaning it was the best in Dublin. He was in Ireland between 1812 and 1818. And I continued to have my wine from Mr. Sneyd after I left. But potential buyers shopped around, often on the recommendations of friends. Wine, who is selling the best at the best price, was a topic of conversation among them, who sometimes shared orders. In 1759, the Dublin wine merchant Christopher Harrison delivered a hogshead of Margaux. This is just to give you an idea of how much were they spending. he delivered a hogshead of Margaux to Thomas Mahon of Strokestown House, which he claimed was the best claret of the second growth. 4 years later, in 1763, Mahon rebuilt and restocked his cellar, and his November wine bill for the previous 6 months came to over £700. That is the equivalent of £145,000 today. So they really did like their wine. Thomas Taylor of Headford paid almost £400 for wines from a number of suppliers over 1784, one item being a ton of claret. And you've seen the size of the ton barrel, it is enormous, and it holds 252 gallons. Dr. Edward Singh, Bishop of Alphin, was particular about the care of his wine. He had 2 cellars. One was in his Dublin house, where his motherless young daughter lived with a staff, and his palace at Elphin. From his main supplier in Dublin, he regularly ordered claret, plus hock, champagne, and French white wine to be delivered to his Dublin house in hogsheads. There it would be strained and sent to Elphin with bottles and corks to be bottled there. This was a 4-day journey to take place when the weather was cool so that the wine would travel better. The acquisition and the taste of wine was a topic of conversation among men, as we have mentioned, and while a personal recommendation was preferable, newspapers were full of ads, though they did sometimes have problems with the spelling. As you can see, O'Brien is called O'Brien, and very often it was called O'Brien. So for people in England who are looking at something like this, they're thinking, O'Brien wine? So an account of wine in the Dublin cellar of Lord Castlereagh, who was Chief Justice from 1798 to 1801, includes 4 hogsheads each of port and claret, plus 1 of Madeira, as well as 206 bottles of claret from Sneyd. Smuggling was another method of acquiring wine, but it wasn't done on as major a scale as you might expect, probably due to the fact it was shipped in hogsheads that were heavy and bulky to handle, and of course, movement did not improve wine. And as Irish people, those who drank the wine, they were fairly clued into wine. You know, they weren't ignorant about it, they were fussy about it, they were choosy about it, and all the rest of it. So they knew perfectly well, no point in going near wine because we're not going to be able to manage it and it could be spoiled. The O'Connell family, we heard a little bit about them today, right enough. Derrynann's house, perfectly located for smuggling. The O'Connell family of Derrynann were known to engage in smuggling up to the 1780s. It was said of them, their faith, their education, their wine, and their clothing were equally contraband. Shipwrecks off the coast, and you see, I'm right. Previous speaker mentioned that. Shipwrecks off the west coast attracted locals in the hope of salvage, and like Scotland, of course, Ireland had so many little coves, they were too numerous to be well guarded. Wrecking, in inverted commas, an extension of smuggling practiced in the Ballyhaig area. What they did, which I thought was absolutely unbelievable, lanterns were attached to the tails of grazing cattle at night to simulate the bobbing lights of vessels at sea and lure unsuspecting ships onto the rocks of Tralee Bay. In the 16th century, Richard Stanihurst observed that Gaelic chieftains were, quote, the most hospitable of men, that you would not please them more than by frequently visiting their houses. Well, in part, the 18th century Anglo-Irish ascendancy adopted this practice, an Englishman commenting that the Irish gentry are an expensive people. They live in the most open, hospitable manner, continually feasting with each other. It was a fair comment. There was criticism of the amounts of food and wine provided, but it really didn't bother them very much, and they didn't change. The display of wealth, however, was important to the ascendancy. and the dining room provided the ideal setting where hosts and guests would sit for hours, enjoying the room itself, its decor, furniture, and furnishings, as well as the meals served in various items of silverware, glassware, and china. And of course, the wine. This is a group family portrait. It's not actually one of an Irish family, but it doesn't matter because it serves the same purpose. In England, it was the same as in Ireland. So if you look at the picture from the left, you can't see him very well, but there's a black servant, young servant, very often beautifully dressed. These young men at the side. There's next to him is a man, one of the staff, taking out the cork from the bottle. And then you have the family beside that. Well, now this was a kind of a show-off picture that was painted in the 18th century, where everybody wanted to show off the very best that they had. So here in this picture, for example, and as I say, it's not an Irish family, but the idea of the whole thing is the same as what they did in Ireland. They're showing off their carpet, very attractive, very, very desirable sort of carpet to have. The people are all dressed absolutely beautifully. They have their wine, they're holding their glasses, plenty of wine in the wine cooler, etc., etc., etc. So it all goes to show a very prosperous family and their enjoyment of wine. So, as I say, lots of money was spent. Here we are, just looking at Westport House reminds me of, something else. This was designed by James Wyatt, and you can see here in this picture the amount of money that was spent on this. First of all, look at the table, the length of the table. It would have cost an absolute fortune. They had plenty of money, but it really would have cost so much money. All of the furniture that's in the room, as well as the decor. The room was designed by James Wyatt. The decor, the floor, the sideboard, the ornaments, and also the dishes, glasses, etc., all on the table. Very, very expensive. Then Castle Cool was another another Wyatt design, mahogany sideboard flanked by urns on pedestals. Under the sideboard, a fluted sarcophagus wine cooler on wheels, of course. This here, can you hear me all right? Yeah, because I can certainly hear the rain. This is quite interesting. It was auctioned in Adams a few years ago, a huge wine cooler. This was the sort of thing that they used in these houses. The wine cooler would be wheeled out. I mean, you're not going around carrying wine or anything like that, but on wheels, so wheeled out, and the wine all ready to be drunk. Yes, Matthews of Thomastown, Grand George Matthew, as he was called, his dining room was 50 feet long and 20 feet wide. Here in the early 18th century, he entertained lavishly, encouraging guests such as Swift to stay as long as they wanted. Swift was delighted. He knew they had darned good wine, and he knew he was going to be well looked after, so he enjoyed his time there. A tavern, in inverted commas, detached from the house, was provided at Thomastown Castle for those who could celebrate the midnight orgies of Bacchus. And as I say, this wine cooler was auctioned by Adams in 2007, and it has the crest of the Matthew family on one side. Corkscrews, of course, were required. The earliest use of one in the minutes of the Wardens of the Goldsmiths Company in 1684. But according to Ted Murphy, a Cork man, marvellous writer, he was the one who really got me going with his terrific book on wine and the drinking of wine in Ireland, which was just so amusing. The term was used, he says, that the term corkscrew was used in the 9th century Latin lyrics of an Irish scholar. So he goes way back. Nobody else went back as far as he did. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. Decanter labels, is that on your slide? No. Decanter labels, we saw one with in Tara's presentation as well, but you had to know which wine you were decanting. If you didn't have labels on the on the wine itself, you really had to be very careful of what you were doing. So the waiter or the staff member who was looking after the wine had to be very careful when he was choosing the wine in the cellar, so that he would have it well labelled, correctly labelled, etc. And then what I loved was the little double decanter for ease of journeying around the table. And of course, at that time, wine, especially when men were together, wine would go in one direction. So the wine was always going, I can't remember which way, but anyway, it always went around the table in one direction. And then, of course, another thing, this is all showing off your wealth. This is absolutely about showing off what you have: food, wine, silver, everything like that, furniture, the whole lot. It was a hell of an undertaking. It must have been absolutely ghastly for the family themselves. Yes. The butler responsible for the service of wine, yeah, that's absolutely fine. He was well aware, the host was well aware that his social standing and taste would be judged on the appearance and quality of his table. As Anna Moran puts it, merely possessing the appropriate objects was not sufficient. One had to interact with them in the correct fashion. Indeed, some were of the opinion that a person's rank and worth could be judged on the basis of how one held one's glass. And here's a good example of how to do that, with these men very gently holding the base of the glasses of wine and enjoying their wine. And you can see the wine and wine bottles at their feet. Now, where am I? Yeah, that's a Dutch picture, by the way. Sorry about this. A butler or a servant who had a good knowledge of wine and who was familiar with his master's tastes and the merchants who supplied him was a very valuable asset and much sought after. Some were familiar with the wine cellars of others in the general area. So if after the death of a wealthy neighbour, an auction of his cellar was advertised, he could advise his employer if it was worthwhile attending. It should be said that if the departed owner happened to be a bishop, an auction would attract a large crowd of buyers, as they tended to have excellent wines and entertained accordingly. In fact, one of them, Lord Robert Ponsonby Tottenham, he was the Bishop of Claret, suffered from a skin condition, and he was recommended to immerse himself in a bath of red wine every evening. Unknown to him, after his bath, his enterprising servant duly decanted the contents of the wine into bottles and sold it in the local village. So after dinner, when the women departed from the table, the men were left to throw caution to the winds and drink as much as they wanted, and they did. At male gatherings, particularly in the middle of the 18th century, the bottle was passed, as I mentioned, in one direction, each man under an amount of pressure from his peers to fill his glass. Keeping pace with others, it was an unspoken challenge, and nobody would risk losing face by opting out. So it wasn't easy. It really wasn't easy for men. Except they enjoyed it thoroughly. One man, though, at a male gathering, observing his companions falling victims to the power of drink, slid from his chair, landing under the table, and lying there, eventually felt a little pair of hands working at his throat. And on asking the little boy what he was doing, the child replied, "Sir, I'm the lad that's to loosen the neck clothes." So the host of the evening had provided this boy to ensure that none of the guests choked. John Scott was the first Earl of Clonmel, and he was the Lord Chief Justice of the King's Bench. He ate and drank excessively, becoming grossly overweight, and became known by the nickname Copper-Faced Jack on account of his red face. Drunk every night, a couple of lackeys regularly came at 12 o'clock to carry him to bed. In his diary, he agonized about his career at the bench. The horrors of going to court unprepared and losing your reputation. But this was all in his diary. Next night, he was out again. When Sir Hercules Langrish from Kilkenny was found by his wife with 10 empty claret bottles, she inquired, you can just imagine her, well, have you had any assistance in drinking this? And he said, yes, a bottle of Madeira. Oh dear. Well, what was the result of all of this? Lord Orrery commented in a letter to a friend, Lord Thomond is laid up with the gout. The Irish hospitality has broke out in his feet and pins him down to a great chair and a slender meal. Jonah Barrington remarked that in his grandfather's time, every estated gentleman in the Queen's County, Laois, was honoured by the gout. And just moving on, 3 doctors, I just thought this was so funny because they haven't a clue what they're doing. Doctors believed in the positive aspects of wine. Daniel O'Connell, suffering from a slow nervous fever, was advised by his to drink a bottle of port every day to cure it. Swift found wine essential for my disorders and absolutely necessary. And Sir Edward O'Brien was advised by a friend to confine his drinking to 3 pints of wine instead of bumping away all night with a gallon. Sir Edward Barry, a Corkman, and he was also a physician, by the way, and did write a book on wine. He recommended to a 70-year-old patient a diet that included a pint of the best French claret every day as his only drink. Another patient of his, who'd been ill for some days, was living on a ration of a quart of brandy, a gallon of milk, and 3 new laid eggs. Barry advised him not to exceed the quart of brandy. Though both drinkers and medical practitioners were fully aware in the 18th century that gout was a direct result of too much wine, it made little or no difference to the habit. Sir Edward Barry was measured in his description of the effects of wine. This is now in the 18th century. When taken in just proportion, it surprisingly strengthens and excites the spirit, and in an increasing quantity gives a quick succession of agreeable ideas, banishes grief and fear, but when too far increased, disturbs and weakens all the functions of the mind and body, ends at length in appearance of temporary apoplexy. Of course, one only had to look at occasions in Dublin Castle where, depending on the Lord Lieutenant, the cellars could be almost overflowing with wines. Wine and champagne were used to woo and to persuade. In the early 18th century, the second Duke of Ormond, as Lord Lieutenant, invited the sitting members of Parliament, that is, those who are on the side of the current administration, to select wine from any hogshead in the castle cellars and drink as much as they desired. There were, however, no chairs allowed in the cellar, as, quote, the Duke could not encourage any gentleman's drinking longer than he could stand. Another memorable incumbent was Charles Manners, who was the 4th Duke of Rutland. He arrived in 1784, and on his appointment, he sent his chief cook to France to expand his culinary repertoire by spending time in some of the great kitchens there, such as the Royal Kitchen of Fontainebleau, and a member of his military staff also to France to source the finest food and, importantly, the wine for the castle cellars that included 500 bottles of the very best champagne. It was said of the Duke that his table presented every delicacy which luxury could display, but it didn't end well for him. In 1787, he undertook a 3-month tour of Ireland, enjoying the hospitality of the well-heeled. But the excessive eating and drinking took its toll. 3 days after his return to Dublin, he died of liver failure at the tender age of 33. Many men have probably looked back to the glory days when it was customary for them to remain in the dining room, to drink excessively after dinner, happy that their wives were probably enjoying some fairly animated talk and girl chat and talk and all the rest of it in the drawing room. Well, maybe not. but the men were having a great old time in the dining room. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. You okay to stay?
We're actually going to do questions for Tara and Patricia now, and then have a little break, and then do Charles's talk around about 5. So if anyone has any questions for either of them, please raise your hand and wait for the mic.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, thank you both. Patricia, I'd just like to ask a question, please. You showed a plan of the basement of Leinster House, so thank you for showing us some of the distant origins of the Dáil Bar for a start. And just as well, somewhat less facetiously, you're talking there very often, yes, it's very interesting about the great and the good, but I have 2 questions. You talked about the women in the other room afterwards. Well, how gendered was this? Did maybe I just miss something? Were women allowed to partake of this, or was it frowned upon? And secondly, then, how far down the social scale did the drinking of wine? Obviously, not to this extent, but how commonplace was the drinking of wine beyond great houses?
Okay. Well, with the landed gentry, it was the landed gentry who lived like that. Anybody else, like this, from the sort of middle class down, and certainly the lower classes, certainly didn't drink anything like that. And also they weren't drinking wine necessarily or drinking claret. They would be drinking, not gin. In England it was gin, but here it was whiskey, which was, caused a great amount of anxiety among people by the very fact that they were drinking like that. But no, men and women, at the end of the dinner, the ladies would stay, they'd have possibly a little dessert or something like that. They might have a glass of wine, and then they all departed to the drawing room to, as Congreve called it, their chat and gossip. And then the men were left. It was at that stage that you'd find that these the large wine coolers that I showed you earlier on, they were wheeled out, and then they all got down to some real drinking at that stage. Does that answer your question?
If I could just interrupt you there 1 second. Interestingly, actually, you do come across some elite women who display a fair bit of knowledge about wines. Mrs. Delaney being one, Bishop Singh's daughter another. And in fact, women, drinking amongst elite women in Europe didn't really differ. Women in Sweden or Poland also drank and were very knowledgeable about wine. And later in the 18th century, you found that upper-level servants, such as housekeepers, would demand claret as part of their remuneration, along with tea, which is also a very expensive product. And there are some, there were, according to Samuel Madden, for example, there were some very low-quality drinking establishments where you could find relatively, now they wouldn't have been the absolutely impoverished, obviously, but certainly not very well-to-do people who would attempt to buy something approaching wine in an attempt to drink like their betters. Although it's true that, like the Earl of Chesterfield, who had been Lord Lieutenant, he did say that wine was simply beyond the reach of the lower classes financially.
Quick question on, is there any evidence or much evidence of cures for the morning after the night before's drinking, and can we learn anything from it?
I really don't think so. I mean, I don't think that they got up very early, but they did have to carry on. That was the extraordinary thing about it. You just wonder, if some of them call themselves 6-bottle men, 7-bottle men, even 8-bottle men, and you're wondering, come on, is this just boasting, or is it really true? But they did drink a lot. They still managed to pull themselves together the next morning. I'm quite sure not all of the time or anything like that, but, they managed to carry on. But this was a nighttime thing. They would be up into all hours of the morning drinking. How they carried on, I really just don't know. And whether they did this every night, they probably didn't. But some of them tried to. Yeah.
Sorry,
Oh, I'm sorry.
Patricia, very quickly.
Yeah.
Absolutely wonderful talk, Patricia. Absolutely fantastic. You mentioned in your slide showing the quantities at the end of the 18th century in terms of very fine. Yeah. And one of your notes said the very grand would have been first growth.
Yeah.
Now, are we to take it that that early, what turned out to be the 1855 classification was pretty well settled as a matter of practicalities?
Yeah, the interesting thing was that in England, it seemed to me, and Charles, you might, Charles is there? Oh, there you are, yeah. You might have something to say on that. But just let me say my little bit first anyway. I think that, gosh, I'm sorry now, I've lost what was it? Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, the absolute top-notch claret went to England and Scotland. And then after that, we got ours. There's quite a big story about it. But the English, even when it was very difficult to get wine and the English fell out with the French and all the rest of it, and so they were drinking Portuguese wine, even still, the top-notch people in England and also in Scotland were drinking the best claret all the time. They managed to get it. They weren't supposed to take it into the country, but they managed to smuggle it in various ways, and they were able to drink the top quality. But I don't think we did to any great extent. Okay? Yes?
If I can answer that a little bit, and I'm going to contradict Patricia a little bit there, because first of all, in 1855, you get the official classification of Médoc for the Paris exhibition of that year, but there had been many unofficial classifications long before that. So there was already a sense that there were four growths, crus, Aubryon, Latour, Lafitte, Margaux, that were already considered the top growths. And they even used the term growths, the Irish merchants, or cru in French. But the official classification didn't occur till later on. The little contradiction, I would say, is that those top growths overwhelmingly went not just to England, but to London in particular for that market. Yeah. They weren't going to Scotland, actually. Scotland was mostly drinking smuggled wine as a way to sort of symbolically resist the 1707 increase in taxation as a part of the Union of Great Britain, of England and Scotland to create Great Britain. So they were mostly drinking smuggled wines. And the Irish were actually drinking, as I'll show in my talk, a huge range of wines. They were both a luxury market as well as a mass market. In fact, they were the only country in Europe that filled that role for Bordeaux wines. And that's because their tariff levels, as I'll discuss, were significantly lower than the British tariff level as set in 1707 by the Union. So Ireland actually did have people who were drinking the Aubryon, the Margaux, the Lafitte, Latour, but they also had people who were drinking lesser wines in the way that people in northern France or in Germany, which wasn't called Germany at the time, were also drinking those lesser wines. So anyhow, that's I'll talk a little more about that later on, but that's the question there.
I just wanted to answer to an earlier question about cures for drunkenness, not as a specialist of 18th century, but as a specialist of medieval drunks and medieval physicians' way to cure the natural instinct towards immoderation, the lack of moderation. So they were trying to promote moderation, but knowing that very few of their royal courtly patients would observe moderation, they would say, okay, if you want to drink with premeditation, here's what you should do. And then they also, because they knew that even that would not work all the time, they would advise give some treatment for hangover.
Sorry, if I could just add one other little thing there about the excessive drinking. Yes, it certainly did happen, but it couldn't possibly have been constantly because government wouldn't have functioned if all the parliamentarians were tanked out of their heads all the time. And in fact, there was a critique done of all the members of parliament for some incoming Lord Lieutenant. I can't think off the top of my head who it was. But out of the couple of hundred individuals who were discussed, there were like little pressies about this fellow is for government or this one isn't. Out of those, that number of people, only excessive drinking was only really mentioned in relation to two of them. And one of them was called a foolish drunken fellow, and the other was perpetually drunk. So I think they must have been veritable drunkards. By the standards of the day, then everybody else's drinking was considered relatively benign. And in fact, the Earl of Kildare, after some extremely drunken shindig at the castle, did write to his wife and say everybody complained about hangovers. So, the fact that they were all that badly hungover would seem to suggest that that was an exceptional outing for them all.
I noticed that one of your slides earlier of a family in England showed a little black boy. Oh, yeah. Does that imply that some of these families would have imported slaves from the Caribbean?
Yes, there were a number. For example, the Ely family, there's a big portrait in the National Gallery of Ireland of the Ely family. And over to one side, and pretty well in the shadows, is a little black servant who is like, they dress them up as if they were dolls sometimes, beautifully dressed in sort of gold and white embroidered outfits and all the rest of it. It was a status symbol to say that the Earl of Ely, he had slaves. But he wasn't the only person to have it. Not so many. In England, you find it regularly. And you'll find it regularly in family portraits, or portraits of a woman and her servant, something like that, who would be black. But yeah, it how they got them, but he could have come from Bristol. There was a big slave trade with Bristol and all of that sort of thing. But, nobody mentions anything very much about it, but it's a status symbol. I hope that answers your question.
Just a very brief remark, observation, whatever. Isn't it ironic and I suppose hypocritical that the Anglo-Irish gentry and English gentry were constantly criticising the lower classes for their drinking at this time?
Everybody was criticising the lower classes. Swift, Samuel Madden, they all worried about, and also they worried about the fact that they were looking at examples like all of these posh people drinking as much as they like. So if they can do it, I can do it, type of thing. So they said, especially Samuel Madden, he was very annoyed with the upper classes for drinking so much because they were showing such a bad example to the lower classes. But the lower classes had their whiskey and that sort of thing. So, they did make up. They weren't all that desperately pushed. But, you had also, there was a middle class drinking claret as well. But they wouldn't be entertaining the way we would. But the middle class would be the ones who are saying, oh, I'm a 7-bottle man and I'm an 8-bottle man and that sort of thing. Like the lads, as we would sort of call them nowadays.
Was the figure, the peak figure of... Yeah, here.
Sorry, yes.
Well, was the peak figure of 27,500 ton of wine was for the decade 1770-80, was that per annum or for the entire decade?
I can't remember. I'd have to go back to the slide.
I'm guessing it was per annum.
Yeah.
But in which case that works out at now a ton, if I'm correct, is in around 1,000 litres.
In about 1,000. Yeah. That's right. Yeah, about that.
Yeah.
About,
So So therefore, that would make it 27.5 million litres of wine imported per year,
Yeah.
right? And if it was typically 0.7 litres per bottle, that would be 35 million bottles, okay?
Right.
Now, there were in around, I just checked, in around 4,000 big houses, big country houses in Ireland around 1800. That works out at just short of 10,000 bottles per house consumed per year.
Okay.
That does sound, prodigious. I mean, it barely, I'm
Well,
just...
it sounds like an awful lot. But, that's probably correct.
Yeah, yeah.
Just one hell of a lot. I mean, you just wonder how people survived. I suppose they did die young. But it was extraordinary. I mean, that's what attracted me to the subject in the first place. How on earth did they manage? I never actually worked out how they did manage, but it was great fun finding out.
Sorry, just there's a very good article by James Kelly about general alcohol consumption in 18th century Ireland. I can't think of the exact, it might be alcohol consumption in 18th century Ireland. I'm not sure, I can't remember the title exactly, but it's in the Royal Irish Academy.
I think it's called The Consumption of Wine.
Consumption, it's not just wine, it must be the consumption of alcohol, yeah. Royal Irish Academy proceedings. And he's got some good stats in there.
Are there any more questions? I have one myself. Given this prodigious amount of wine consumption and Swift claiming that he was moderate, did Swift himself comment on the perception of Irishmen as guzzling claret?
I haven't come across a specific comment about them guzzling it, but he does advert to their fondness for it. At one point, he talks about a clerical friend in London that Swift advised him to stick around in London, to improve his career prospects. But that fellow ignored his advice, and Swift's comment was, well, he probably missed the claret of Dublin too much. He had to get back to it. So
That seems like an excellent point to stop.